It's been described as one of the most important free speech cases in US history. Now, I'm not talking about Trump's third indictment, a class action against the Biden administration for allegedly colluding with and coercing social media platforms to suppress disfavored speakers' viewpoints and content during the COVID pandemic. Make no mistake, this is a lawsuit of which the outcome could have implications for us all, wide-ranging and massive indeed. Joining me to debate this, two very interested parties. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is a co-signatory to this lawsuit, a very outspoken voice against lockdowns during the COVID pandemic, and former White House coronavirus response coordinator, Dr. Deborah Birx, who publicly witnessed one of the most infamous, it could be called, moments during the pandemic. Let's just remind ourselves.
Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that.
Dr. Deborah, I will come to you first on that. I know you probably end up getting asked this a lot. We don't want to dwell on that past too much. But I remember watching that very clearly, listening to the president at the time, Donald Trump, talking about that, talking about injecting bleach, watching you on the sidelines there and wondering what was going through your mind.
Well, you know, he was talking to Dr. Bryant. You can see his head and you can see he's turned away from me. And we actually had scientists, Dr. Bryant, do a study so the kids would get back outside. It was April, it was spring. I was worried about kids being inside. Mayors would not they closed all the playgrounds, and I wanted children out on the playgrounds. So we asked the scientists to study sunlight compared to disinfectant for metal, plastic, and cardboard to be able to reassure parents and mayors that children could go outside because the sun was a great disinfectant for COVID. Somehow, between when we discussed that at task force and 45 minutes later, when we came to the press briefing, I think Dr. Bryant had gone to the Oval and engaged the president in discussing this as a therapeutic. It was never studied as a therapeutic. It was studied, in fact, that would be dangerous. It was studied for playgrounds and to get children outside.
So you're saying there was a bit of a miscommunication going on. And I do want to say you've got a book coming out, Silent Invasion, The Untold Story of the Trump Administration, COVID-19 and Preventing the Next Pandemic Before It's Too Late, of which our viewers can maybe hear a bit more about that. But Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, I want to come to you on this court case we're hearing about at the moment, the Biden administration, well, a case against the Biden administration, this idea that the government allegedly is coercing or suppressing social media companies to silence voices like yours. I think it's fair to say, because you have said you've been sort of shadow banned on Twitter, for example, for things you've said about lockdowns. What made you a co-signatory on this lawsuit?
There's nothing alleged about it. The Biden administration has an enormous censorship complex basically aimed at controlling and silencing voices on social media that criticize its policies. In fact, it uses the muscle it has over the regulatory, regulation of social media to induce Twitter, Facebook, you name it, to slag lockdown opponents, and in fact to suppress criticism of the misinformation that the Biden administration itself is putting out on things like immunity after COVID recovery, on the inefficacy of the vaccine to stop disease spread, on the efficacy of masks, vastly overstating the evidence on that, on the harms of the school closures. It was on item after item. What you see is the Biden administration suppressing the speech of critics, using its government power to censor in a way that is not consistent with the American First Amendment.
Well, it's alleged until it's proven in a court of law, of course, and that's what we'll have to wait and see. But thanks for setting out your stall on that. Dr. Birx, I want to come to you and get your response to that, because you have said previously with regard to kind of the post-match analysis, even though some would argue the pandemic's still going, that some of the backlash against the way it was handled to some extent is deserved or warranted. Do you think the same with this social media argument?
Well, I loved your last segment because it talked about empowering the consumer with all the information they needed in order to make decisions on what to buy. And even today, we don't put transparent information out there about infectious diseases. I mean, we're talking about an app on buying coffee, and we don't have an app where everybody across the world can see what's circulating in their area so they can make decisions about themselves and their families. because there are people that are still very vulnerable to COVID. My mother is 94 in a multi-generational household. Yes, she's been vaccinated, but vaccines in someone that elderly with that poor of an immune response, she may not mount an immune response. And so it's my job to provide the tools that we have to protect her, but every family is different. And that's why I've always found, I've worked in pandemics around the globe. If you empower the community with the information that they need, they will make common sense decisions that protect themselves and their families. I've seen this with COVID. I've seen it with Zika. I've seen it with Ebola. And I don't know why we can't give people transparent information that they can utilize on a day-to-day basis.
Well, certainly plenty of health officials, yourself included, both of you, tried to get the information that you saw was right and scientific out during the pandemic. Also, Dr. Fauci, also here in the United Kingdom, Chris Whitty, these top scientists. But it could be argued that the relationship between the public and the scientists, the public health authorities, broke down so dramatically over the course of the pandemic, whether that was due to government behaviour or what some would call unelected bureaucrats overstepping the line, depending on what side of the argument you sit on. But in terms of disseminating that information and the public actually taking it on board, Dr. Bhattacharya, can you not understand that there is an element of misinformation when it comes to things like Twitter, or should we probably call it now X? Does it not concern you?
I mean, I think the solution to misinformation of any sort is trust. And what happened during the pandemic is that the government it embraced censorship, it embraced positions that were contrary to the science, and then closed up the possibility of debate and criticism from the outside. And as a result, vast numbers of people no longer trust the government, the information that it provides. And so when there is actual misinformation afoot, they're not going to trust the US CDC or the US NIH anymore, because the NIH and the CDC itself embraced in misinformation. So if you want to combat misinformation, the answer is not censorship. The answer is to build trust in public institutions by behaving in trustworthy ways, and that is not what happened. By the way, a court actually did find the findings. It's no longer alleged. The court actually did find that the censorship is going on by the Biden administration. These are facts that were entered in court and not disputed by the government. There are emails, depositions of Tony Fauci and others in the government who participated in the censorship industrial complex.
I just want to ask you what that trustworthy behaviour would look like, if you to boil it down, because if you have a volume of information coming at the public, they're trying to work out who they can trust or not, and this is what the COVID pandemic felt like for many. What does that trustworthy behaviour look like? How can people discern it?
Well, I think one is humility and openness to criticism, right? So if you have a high government official saying, if you criticize me, you're not simply criticizing a man, you are criticizing science itself. Well, that's just ridiculous. No one who can look at that and say, well, yeah, that person actually is able to keep an open mind and see if he's wrong, admit it. That kind of behavior exemplifies exactly how the government behaved throughout the pandemic. And as a result, a tremendous number of people, and they got things wrong. It wasn't simply that they were embracing science and they got it right and they're criticizing people on the outside who got it wrong. They got things wrong over and over and over again. They overemphasized the efficacy of masking and mask mandates. They ignored immunity after COVID recovery. They ignored the vast evidence that if you get the vaccine, you can be infected again. And embraced mandates in its place. Now, a lot of people lost their jobs over this. So, it's not like it's so clear that the government got it right. And then they also block debate. I mean, I think if you want to build trust, you have to build institutions that are willing to engage in debate and be open-minded instead of what we had during the pandemic.
And it's funny, Dr. Birx, you mentioned that we're speaking about culture wars at the start of the show and values-based buying, because a lot of this does strike to that argument about whether people are thinking in an ideological way or believing science, and whether both can happen at the same time. It's all about freedom of speech. It's all about being able to choose your side, isn't it? But when it comes to a pandemic and a public health emergency, do scientists know best? Is there a rationale for them overstepping and dictating how people should live?
Well, I think we've learned from prior pandemics that you have to put all the information out there in a digestible way. And when you cut corners pretending that if you were infected, you are protected from future infections. You're not protected from COVID if you've been naturally infected or multiply vaccinated. You can get infected. And I just feel like we've divided this into an absolute when this is not an absolute virus. We don't even know to this day whether long COVID, what it really is, how many people get it, and what are the long-term consequences of multiple COVID infections. It is not flu. It's a unique virus. It is still being discovered what it does. And I agree with Dr. J about really continuing to put the information out there in an honest and transparent way so that people can make decisions by both ignoring the fact that COVID is still with us, as well as pretending that our vaccines can reduce herd immunity and protect against infection, leads people absolutely confused. And you see this even now today in the United States, where they have politicized rural health and implying that people in rural areas are dying at a higher rate because of their vaccine status. It is because they don't have access to any tools, because primary care isn't there anymore. And they've been dying at a higher rate from cancer, diabetes, hypertension, all of these other diseases for 15 years. And we're acting like it was because of how they voted versus their access to healthcare. So I'm hoping that everybody steps back and looks at what the true issues are. And for the UK, please keep your data up. We've decided that COVID doesn't exist and we've taken our data down. So I use your data to understand what's happening and what we're going to see in the United States in order to protect my mother.
Well, you're going to get a lot more data. Apparently, there's a lot of people with COVID in the UK at the moment. Dr. J, before we wrap up this conversation, I just want to ask you, information is one thing, but legislation, of course, is another. At least 30 states with Republican legislation have passed laws since 2020 limiting public health authorities. That was reported in the Washington Post. So basically legislating into the next pandemic that health authorities can't say you must wear a mask or these schools can't be locked down. Depends on a state-by-state basis. Do you think that's wise?
Yes, I do. I think that the public health authorities abused their trust the public had in them during the pandemic, violated basic civil liberties, including freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to worship, and huge violations of basic rights. People like need to live. They need to, go see their elderly parents. They need to, and authoritarian orders that violate that should not be given in the hands of public health who have shown themselves to be untrustworthy. If public health wants to control behavior, they should do it in honest ways by giving good, solid information, being open to correction from the outside. And then if they're giving honest advice, people will listen to it. It's trust that is the key, not mandates and authority of the sort that public health arrogated itself during the pandemic.
The World Cup in Qatar is becoming the most entertaining, perhaps, of all time. A bit of disappointment for those who attempted to overshadow the tournament with sanctimonious virtue signalling, including memorably the Germany players who covered their mouths before their game against Japan before losing the game 2-1 and crashing out of the tournament. They were widely mocked by Japanese supporters and Qatari TV hosts who covered their mouths and waved goodbye as the Germans got the first flight home. Well, Arsenal legend Arsene Wenger, now FIFA's head of development, summed it up rather well.
And the teams as well, who were mentally ready, like Jürgen said, at the mindset to focus on competition and not on political demonstrations.
Well, I'm thrilled to be joined now by the sportscasting legend, Bob Costas, one of America's greatest sporting commentators, a veteran of a record 12 Olympic Games, winning no fewer than 28 Emmy Awards for his peerless commentary. Bob, what a treat to have you on Piers Morgan Uncensored. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Piers. Great to see you again, even from a distance.
I have one daytime Emmy, and I've never covered an Olympics, so you're slightly ahead of me, and I bow to your superiority quite willingly. This whole issue, Bob, I just couldn't think of a better person to talk to about where the line is drawn between political activism, or social justice activism for that matter, and sport, and this issue of sport washing, whether it's in golf with the live golfers and the PGA at war, whether it's what we've been seeing in Qatar at the World Cup with people saying they're going to protest, then not protesting, then being ridiculed for it. Others like the Iranian players making a genuinely powerful stand against oppression of their women back home. Going right back perhaps to Colin Kaepernick, who was, of course, the NFL player who took the knee for the first time. And the England players at this World Cup are still taking the knee in his honour, I guess, because he was the one who started it. So it's a lot of stuff going on in this area. What is your overview of political activism and sport?
I think, Pierce, we have to make distinctions from one situation to another, one person to another. Just because I may agree with a general cause or issue and with the person's right to make a statement doesn't mean that I have to agree with everything they say under that banner. Colin Kaepernick is a good example. There's no question, even if some people may overstate the severity, there's no question that police reform is an important issue in the United States. And where it needs to be reformed, the burden primarily falls upon people of color in the United States. That's legitimate. But then when Colin Kaepernick subsequently says, I don't vote because the oppressors will never allow you to vote your way out of your oppression. When he said that, Barack Obama was president. I guess he didn't vote when Donald Trump ran against Hillary Clinton, and then Donald Trump became president. That's a silly and naive thing to say, even if I respect the initial point that Colin Kaepernick wanted to make. Within this year's World Cup, the Iranians not only are making a very important point, it's a courageous point to make, because heaven knows what might happen to any of them when they return home, and they're directly involved in that. Some might say that others at a safe distance, covering their mouths or whatever, are merely virtue signaling. But then it all circles back to the IOC, in their case, putting 2 Olympics in China, another one in Vladimir Putin's Russia, and FIFA now going to Qatar. As you have stated previously, and I agree with this, obviously, every nation has flaws and problems and issues and things that they need to correct and shame in their past, and maybe in some cases in an ongoing way. But then there are nations in the here and now, we're not talking about history, in the here and now, that are fundamental human rights abusers. Qatar is one of those. China is certainly one of those. Putin's Russia is one of those. And these athletes will never have a platform that will draw as many eyes and make as large an impact as they do at an Olympics or at a World Cup. And it's ironic that FIFA and the IOC say, let's keep politics out of this. Please keep politics out of this. But they're the ones who put politics in it by placing these events in places like Qatar and Sochi and in Beijing. So as long as the protest, whatever it may be, is not within the match or the game itself, because people do want to watch the game or the match for its own sake, and it's very exciting. I think you undermine your own cause if you get in the way of the game itself. But surrounding the game, or for commentators in the programming that precedes the game or at halftime or post-game, then I think it's okay.
You see, well, a brilliant response, as I would have expected, and very thoughtful and nuanced in many places. I would take issue, I think, about a couple of things you said. The main one, I think, is this. There was a lot of, I think, over-the-top virtue signalling about Qatar from the UK in particular. Not from America, interestingly. But in the UK, a lot of sort of anger built up in the very last minute about a World Cup that was awarded 12 years ago. The Middle East has never had a World Cup. If the stick to beat the Middle East on human rights is ill treatment of migrant workers and LGBT rights, for example, then you're basically saying you can't have a sports tournament in the Middle East at all, because they would all have similar issues with migrant worker treatment and outlawing LGBT rights completely in most countries. But you'd also have the same situation in Africa. You'd have the same situation in China, the same situation in vast swathes of India, of Russia, and so on. And so I think that what I would say back to you, Bob, on that point, once you start putting the moral halo on about human rights, I'm not sure you can end up with many places in the world which are clean enough to actually host, say, a World Cup. And I'll throw it back to you in this way. You and I have both actually got into trouble at different times in our careers in America, yours more successful than mine, about gun control, for example. You expressed a view about gun control when you were on air once and got a lot of blowback. I did a lot more and got a lot more blowback and got told to go back to the UK. But the next World Cup is in America, shared with Canada and Mexico. Should people be taking a strident view, for example, about gun violence in America as an issue, about abortion laws, which have just dramatically changed, which are very contentious in many other parts of the world, what America's done there? In other words, if you continue down the road of putting a halo on and deciding who is fit to host these things, I think you've got to be consistent and accept that every country, including America, including Britain, which helped America illegally invade Iraq, of course, in 2003, that we all have actually pretty big abuses, which would be quite hard to defend.
Yeah, there are matters of degree. The points you make are legitimate. And by the way, just parenthetically, as you know, my point about guns in America and as it affects athletes was to say that there is a gun culture in America, not to take issue with the fundamental idea of the Second Amendment,
Right.
which is a big deal in the United States. But even if you believe in the Second Amendment, you should also be able to recognize that there's a lot of irresponsibility surrounding guns, and some of it had crossed over into sports. So that was the comment I was trying to make. But sometimes people get irrational about certain things, hear what they want to hear, and take it from there. So forgive me for that parenthetical aside.
Yeah.
I think the point you're making is legitimate, but it's a question of degree. If we're looking for a perfect nation, maybe you'd have to hold every Olympics in Switzerland,
Right.
which ironically enough is where the IOC is located in Lausanne. But we're talking about degree. The United States most certainly has its problems, and athletes historically and sometimes movingly have registered their complaints and their protests about that. But Qatar, Putin's Russia, Beijing, they are fundamental human rights abusers. It's definitive about them, rather than flaws that the nations we're talking about, the United Kingdom or the UK, America, Canada, they are actively trying to address, however imperfectly, however haltingly. It's within their DNA, it's within the American Constitution to address these inequities and injustices, whereas it is the policy of the governments of Qatar and China and Putin's Russia to oppress people and engage in many cases, Russia in this case, international treachery. Did the United States make a huge mistake post 9/11 in invading Iraq? Yes, they did. But I think you could make a strong case that that is not fundamentally what the United States is about.
I mean, it's an interesting rejoinder. I mean, I would say, having been in Qatar last week, there's a lot of, I think, resentment and raised eyebrows about what they perceive to be the West's moral hypocrisy. And they feel quite strongly about it, that they've been over-demonized and the West under-demonizes itself and doesn't want to turn the same critical eye to its own moral failings. And they pointed to, like in the UK, for example, we have appalling drug abuse now in our country. It's sort of rife with drugs now. Appalling knife crime. All sorts of metrics for sort of moral degeneration, if you like, which is anathema to a lot of people in the Middle East, where the drug laws are incredibly draconian. There's very little knife crime of the kind we have in the UK and so on. So it was actually being there on the ground was really quite interesting. And it's not to defend everything that they stand for, but I do think it's a commonality through the Middle East, pretty much what Qatar represents. And they believe they're representing the whole region with the World Cup. And I have to say, having been there, Bob, it was a very good atmosphere. It felt very safe. Everything was, running very smoothly. And it's not like, I know the Germans ran the trains well under Hitler. It's more, I was there and they all seemed to be having a pretty good time, I have to say.
Well, the World Cup is a wonderful event. And from what I hear from a distance, it has been run smoothly, just as you say. One thing I heard repeatedly when I hosted the Olympics, I always asked the heads of the IOC when they brought them in for an interview, what is it with this seeming affinity for authoritarian nations with the IOC? And the answer always was, we feel that by holding an Olympics anywhere, it helps to spread the Olympic ideals of equality and diversity and democracy. It helps to spread those ideas. How's that working out with China? How's that working out with Putin's Russia? And we'll see if there are any reforms in Qatar or Iran. I tend to doubt it.
Right. Bob, I could talk to you all night. What I wanted to ask you before I let you go, you've interviewed so many fascinating people in the sporting world. If you could literally, if it was your last hour on Earth, which I hope won't come for a very long time, who would you, of every sportsman and woman you've ever met, who would you most like to spend that hour with? Dead or alive?
Well, if it's the one, all right, well, then you just answered the question. Dead or alive, because of my affinity for baseball, I would like to sit Babe Ruth down with Jackie Robinson. Babe Ruth was the greatest player pre-integration. Jackie Robinson is not the greatest player, although he's a great player, but he's perhaps the most significant player in the modern history of baseball. And to have them talk not only about baseball, but about the country they grew up in. Ruth at the turn of the century and Jackie Robinson in the middle of the 20th century. That's the interview I'd like to conduct.
Brilliant. I would choose Sir Donald Bradman, who statistically, the Australian batsman, cricket, statistically the greatest sportsman of all time. The gap between him and the second-placed international average player was greater than the gap between 1 and 2 of any other sport in the world.
You know, I once referred to Sir Donald in a piece on HBO as the Babe Ruth of cricket.
And in fact, there's a great picture of the two of them meeting. It's a wonderful picture. Yeah, Bradman and Babe Ruth. It's an amazing picture. Bob, thank you so much for joining me. Honestly, I could talk to you all night. You're such a fascinating guy, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Piers. Hope we talk again soon.
Good to talk to you. All the best. I think one of the worst things that any government can do is, in a national crisis, order the public of whatever country it may be to do one thing, and then secretly themselves, the very people issuing the orders, do another. And this lockdown party scandal that's rocked Downing Street, I think, has resonated throughout the country because every one of us made huge sacrifices. Some people couldn't see their dying relatives, while Boris Johnson and his staff were gallivanting, apparently on a weekly basis, breaking the very laws inside Downing Street where they made them that they were ordering the rest of us to do. Absolutely disgraceful. To understand just how brilliant the NHS is, go somewhere else in the world and have an accident and see what happens to you. You know, I fell off a Segway, very embarrassingly, in Santa Monica. And all I can remember is I lay literally drifting in and out of consciousness, having broken 5 ribs and collapsed my lung, was somebody waving a bit of paper over me to see if I was insured and to tell me how much this was about to cost me. Whereas if an American had done that in London, they would just get treated. That's the difference between here and, say, the United States, which has, by comparison, a terrible health system that punishes those with very little money and is all based around pharmaceutical companies making billions of dollars. We are incredibly fortunate to have this system. It's not perfect, it's flawed in many ways, but my God, if you have an emergency, you want to be having it in this country with our doctors, our nurses, our surgeons, our consultants. Best in the world. Mikel Arteta, well, he talks a good game, but as Muhammad Ali once said, if you're going to talk the talk, you've got to walk the walk. And right now, it is distinctly unimpressive in terms of the walk. So Arteta, I think, needs to step up and start winning things or step out. I like Taylor Swift. When Damon Albarn from Blur gave her a whack recently saying she didn't write her own songs and she blew up at him and took him down on Twitter, I cheered her on. I think she's gutsy. Great singer, great songwriter, great talent. I like her. The UK Supreme Court will rule tomorrow whether Scotland can hold a new independence referendum without the UK government's consent. Legendary actor Brian Cox is back in the hot seat here and has been one of the fiercest and most famous advocates for breaking up the union. Brian, good evening. How are you?
I'm good.
Let me before we get into.
Actually, ironically, I don't want to break up the union, but I've got another idea for the union.
Go on.
United Federation.
What, explain.
Independent countries working in Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and England, because I think England gets a lot of the tap end of the bath. I'm by nature an Anglophile. That's where I studied here in London, so I'm very disposed to that. What I just believe in is the independent states, but we come together as a united federation.
Is that not what the UK is supposed to be?
But it's not, because too many decisions are made on behalf of, like this major decision that's been made in Wales about this Chinese thing, you know, whether it's supposed to be contentious. There's a dangerous element, they say, but the Welsh are getting no say in the matter, which I think is really wrong. So I'm all for, I don't want to break up the union because it's, you know, we are the British Isles, but I want my country, not just my country, I want Wales, Scotland, and England to be independent.
I mean, what's interesting, we had a lot of debate, obviously, about whether to leave the European Union. And a recent survey this week in YouGov says now only 32% of Britons now think it was the right thing to do to leave. 56% think it was wrong. That's a massive shift.
Absolutely. But that was so corrupt. I mean, so rotten, the whole thing. And we, Scotland, voted 62% to stay.
Yes, I know. But does that not give you pause for thought about leaving a collective entity, which brings with it at least strength in numbers, is the argument?
But the north of England, who have been systematically ignored time and time again, are getting, they're well cheesed off about the fact that they don't have enough say in their life, And you think of the great things that Andy Burnham's doing in Manchester, for example. And I'm all for the England expressing themselves in the same way that Scotland does, and that we come together in a proper federation where we contribute. We don't do that now because the rules are all set down here.
And the problem, I think, if I was Scottish right now, given the utter fiasco of the way this government has behaved in the last 6 months alone, from Boris Johnson...
We both agree upon
that.
Well,
we went on Question Time and
we did.
Equally raged. But it has been completely shameful that we've had these 3 prime ministers now. Boris Johnson, total shambles with all the nonsense he got up to. Liz Truss, unbelievably, for that short 44 days, even worse, tanking the economy, tanking the pound, tanking everything, and now we're picking up the pieces. And now Rishi Sunak has to try and repair all the damage. But if I'm Scottish looking at all this, I'm thinking, look at these London politicians behaving like reckless casino owners with our money, and we have no real say over what these people are doing.
That's my point. You've just made my point.
Well, I agree, but I see that's where I have sympathy.
No, and that's the whole point. But the problem is that systematically, again and again and again, we'll have those guys and those gals making those decisions. I don't know what's going to happen in the next election. I suppose that probably Labour will get in, but we need vision. We need real vision, and those creatures were just
Who do you see out there that you think is actually an impressive politician who might have a vision?
Well, I believe in Nicola Sturgeon.
Yeah.
I do. Yes, I do. I think, and they've had a lot of problems up there.
You're right.
Don't get me wrong. They've had a lot of problems, but I do trust Nicola. I think she's the genuine article.
I mean, I'm going to say, in her credit, she's always faced the music. I've done many interviews with her, often quite hostile. She always comes back. She doesn't duck interviews like Boris did for so many years. Yeah. She's divisive, but she certainly has what I would call leadership skills.
Exactly. And she's a great leader, and I think she will lead us. But as I say, Piers, and I really mean this, and people say, oh, you go on about independent Scotland. I'm interested in the countries in this country, in this kingdom, so-called United Kingdom, being separate, being individual.
So completely autonomous, but they also are part of a federation.
Exactly. That's exactly what I feel.
But in the federation, I mean, who would have any power in that? Would it be equal powers?
No, it would be equal power, and there would be...
What would the federation decide that the independent, autonomous countries couldn't decide for themselves?
Well, most of the stuff domestically they could decide for themselves. But when it comes to the interchange with each country, then they would have to come to some kind of agreement. It won't be easy, but it never is.
What do you do, for example, about currency? Because it would take you years to go back into the EU, which is still, I think, what more Scots would prefer to do. But it would take years to facilitate. Well, the Bank of England have said if you leave the UK, you can't have the pound. So what do you do? It's practical level. What do you do?
Well, it's a thing that one has to encompass. You're going to have to deal with it one way or the other. But then again, we didn't go euro. We kept the pound during this whole situation. So we never made that. We never made that transition. I don't know what would happen in terms of. But then, if we had a united federation, we would come to some decision on that very subject. That's what we would do. What
about the border? Because we have this nightmare from Brexit of Northern Ireland and what to do with it. There's this belief that if Scotland really wants independence, you've got to sort of rebuild Hadrian's Wall. Are you going to be standing there with your marauding armour, fending off the invading English?
No, that's...
New William Wallace? You got a bit of Wallace about you.
Yeah, I know. I actually played William Wallace on television 100 years ago.
Perfect cast.
But no, I think that...
But what do you do? Practical level, what do you do about a border if you are a genuine independent country?
Well, how do you deal with a border between Belgium and France? How do you deal with a Belgium between France and Spain?
Would you have a physical border?
You would just have the border. It would be there. It would be at Hadrian's Wall, which is a natural border.
Do you think, when you go up to Scotland, what's the mood about, would you say? Because the polls at the moment do not see a majority in any of the polls for wanting to have an independent Scotland or indeed another referendum. So why do you believe you're nearer to it now than you were?
Well, I just think because, certainly in Scotland's, it changes daily, because there's always... And the Scots are notoriously contentious. They can be very contentious, the Scots. I know because I am one. I was watching Peter Capaldi the other night, and he said, the great gift of my family was family and sarcasm. And I think that's very true. Sorry, what was your question again?
No, my question is, the mood, what is it about the mood in Scotland, do you think, which makes you think the polls are wrong?
Well, like
people do want to have a genuine independent country.
Because we've seen what's happened recently, which has been pretty horrific, with Johnson, Truss, very briefly. Did somebody else come in? Well, it's now Richie Sunak, So, and that party has just gone from worse to worse to worse to worse to worse. So we don't want any truck with that. We're like Blanche Dubois. We're always depending on the kindness of strangers. And in a way, we just need to be able to form. And also it's to do with culturally who we are. We're culturally different. We're not the same. And, when I grew up in Scotland, it was North Britain. And the great thing about Scotland, and the SNP party was regarded as a joke, but they have moved towards. You see, why I became part of Scottish. I don't like the word nationalist. I've never liked the word national, but I believe in Scottish independence. Nationalist is too contentious a word for me. But when Blair made the whole fiasco, which we're still suffering from in the Middle East, and he got into bed with, Cheney and Rumsfeld and the puppet, as he was really, Bush, and Halliburton and oil. I just thought it's so obvious that this is a corrupt thing that's happening, and we should not be part of it.
Yeah.
Now, in Scotland, we would say, no, we're not going to do that. But, of course, we have no power. We had no power to make any opinion. And I was a Labour man for a long time, and I'm still a socialist in principle. But, at the end of the day, that's why I think we have to come back to ourselves.
It was interesting. I mean, you brought up Iraq. I was editor of the Daily Mirror. We opposed the Iraq war. We lost the campaign, sadly. But when you look at this furore in Qatar, what do you make of it? Because my argument is that I'm not sure we are morally pure enough here to really be talking to the Qataris about how their laws are or anything else.
Well, I think to a certain extent you're right. But I also think that I think what's happening, let's look at Iran and let's look at what's happening in Iran, where there's a sort of possible female revolution, and it's being led by women.
Right.
See, I do think the patriarchy is over, and I think we need to give these women the rights that they deserve, and we haven't done it. And I think that goes for most of the Middle Eastern nations, but that's also to do with religion. We don't go into that, but certainly these women need to be freed up in a way that they're not being freed up.
How would Logan Roy react to the patriarchy being over?
He would do something else, because he's But I also think, going back to the question of Qatar, that should have been dealt with a long time ago. I mean, Sepp Blatter has already admitted it was a corrupt thing.
Yeah.
So we know it was corrupt, but they should have dealt with it a long time ago, not now. This is not the point.
But see, when I had that debate before, I spoke to you with Arsaka. I mean, when you actually do try and work out where is morally pure enough to have a World Cup.
Iceland.
Right. I mean, you're pretty much in Iceland every year, right?
Yeah.
And even there, if we dug deep enough with all the world's journalists, you'd probably find all sorts of problems there. Well, my point being that it's tricky, right? You can't just obviously have it in Iceland every year.
You could. Well, it's not every year, it's every 4 years.
But why shouldn't the Middle East have a World Cup?
Well, no, I think they should have a World Cup, but there's a lot of stuff that's gone on. I mean, the Saudis beat Argentina yesterday.
Incredible.
But then think of what the Saudis did to that journalist in Turkey.
Of course.
Exactly. So
But is that any more morally repugnant than us illegally invading Iraq?
Well, we haven't done that kind of thing. We haven't actually.
Well, we illegally invaded a sovereign country and 1 million people died.
That's what we did. We did it.
I mean, I'm not sure there's a moral difference, to be honest.
Yeah, but just because there wasn't a moral difference doesn't mean to say you have to not abandon that issue and just saying perhaps there needs to be a bit of morality in dealing with things.
Let's take a short break. I want to come back. You're a Manchester United fan.
I am.
And you saw the Ronaldo interview?
I did. Great interview.
I'm going to get your reaction to Ronaldo after the break. Welcome back to Piers Morgan Uncensored. Brian Cox is still with me. Brian, you're a Man United fan, the biggest star arguably United's ever had. Cristiano Ronaldo went public in this big interview with me. Let's just have a reminder of some of the things he said. They're trying to force you out, you think?
Yes, not only the coach, but the other 2 or 3 guys there around the club.
At the senior executive level?
Yes, that I felt betrayed. I don't know what's going on, but since the Sir Alex Ferguson left, I saw not evolution in the club. The progress was zero. The Glazers, they don't care about the club. The empathy with the coach is not good. I'm honest.
You don't have a good relationship with him?
I'm not mean good relationship.
Do you think he respects you?
I think he don't respect the way I should deserve.
Well, you must have been worried sick. I mean,
I was very worried.
You lost your baby son, and now your baby daughter's in hospital.
Exactly. Kind of that didn't believe that something going wrong, which is make me feel bad.
Really?
Yes. They
didn't believe you.
They believe you, but in the same way, their piece ever gonna change the health of my family for the football. Never.
Cristiano Ronaldo, that interview's now been viewed 15 million times on our YouTube channel. 45 million more views of the clips on social media, making it one of the biggest, most watched interviews in history, certainly for sport. What did you make of it, Brian? I mean, Cristiano Ronaldo, United legend, torching really the club. What did you think?
Well, I think I can see where he's coming from. But he also has to understand that it is not Alex Ferguson anymore. It's not that United. And I could see that there was probably a great sentimental movement to go back to the club where he really began, where it all began. And Alex, well, you know, there's nobody like Alex Ferguson.
And Alex persuaded him.
And Alex persuaded him to come back.
Yeah.
Well, thinking, naturally, because Alex loves the club, he's trying to keep the club. But the club has gone through so many changes in the last few years. Now, playing for Juventus and playing for Real Madrid, and their clubs have been in an incredible, they haven't stopped, they're just the top of the league. Manchester United has not been playing well over the last few years, but it's beginning to get its mojo back. And I think it's unfortunate that this has happened. And
is he entitled to speak out, do you think?
Well, of course he's entitled to speak out, but also one has to examine exactly where he's coming from. And I think he's coming from a place where he's saying, you know, I wanted to go back to a beginning. I wanted to go back to that glory days where I was a young boy. And I understand.
He said his heart ruled his head to a degree.
His heart ruled his head to a degree. And in a sense, that's going to be difficult, and a manager who's trying to create a new club, and there's going to be a clash.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite tragic, actually, and it's tragic for him, but it's also tragic for the club.
Yeah.
You know, and I think the club has to be given a break on this. I mean, I do think it's hard. It's clearly hard because his expectation must have been huge. And especially if Alex persuaded him to go back, that must have been a huge thing. But he's been disappointed. And you can't take away his disappointment because it is not the same club that he was at all those years ago. And
have you ever had a situation in your career when you've been tempted to walk out? Or have you walked out of a show, a play, a TV show, anything like that?
No. I'm clever enough to avoid going into those situations.
Have you seen people do it?
Yeah, I've seen people walk away, and I've understood why they do it, and it's usually complex reasons.
I mean, I did it, actually.
Well, yeah.
But I did it because actually, when I listened to Ronaldo, I sort of thought, it actually comes down to respect. I think it doesn't matter what the job is, if you actually feel disrespected in your workplace.
That's right.
And you feel you're being forced down an alleyway you don't want to go down. I actually think there's a certain merit in just saying, actually, it's not for me.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe. I'm glad the interviews had the coverage that it's had in terms of. Amazing. 15 million is quite incredible. But at the same time, I'm going. It's rather sad that that's the view you're going to get because, I think, and certainly with his kids and with his family and. Going back to Manchester is a difficult thing.
I think losing the baby in the tragedy with the twins and one died and one lived, that's got to really get to any human being.
And
so I think he wanted a bit more of an arm wrap.
Yeah, and he didn't get it.
Yeah.
And that's...
It may just really be as simple as that.
Yeah.
Talking of arm wraps, extraordinary series you've got on Channel 5, How the Other Half live, both rich, but particularly pertinently, I thought, the poor. And you went down for this series. You went to food banks. I want to show a little clip first and ask you about this.
Well, actually,
I come here every Friday so that I can feed my son over the weekend. We're working part-time and we still can't afford anything. Yeah. My electricity has gone up from £44 a month to £170 a month.
that's astronomical.
It really is hard going, it really is. We prioritise our children and go without, and I think that's what all adults and parents are doing just now, really, isn't it?
It's shocking how Dundee's gone pretty much full circle, getting back to the poverty I saw as a kid. It's extremely painful, this stuff. You know, it's painful for anybody. If you've got any sensibility at all, this stuff is painful.
So they weren't, you just corrected me there, they weren't food banks. They're
No,
called community larders. Explain the distinction.
Well, the difference is what people feel about food banks is loss of dignity.
Yeah.
And the one thing that human beings have, even when they don't have any money, is some kind of dignity, some kind of feeling of well-being of who they are. And what the community larder does is it charges the minimal, but it means you're paying for something. So there's a transaction.
You're not being given it.
You're not being given it, and it's not begging, because a lot of being in food banks feels like begging. And the fact that they're being constantly legitimized is really irksome to me. But this community larder, run by these two amazing women who actually ran a playgroup, and it was out of a playgroup they decided to go on to this. And people like Lidl, Morrison's, they give stuff which is coming up to its sell-by date that then they can tap on. And the thing that you don't see in the program, which is one of my angers with my editors in that, anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the thing you don't see is a guy who came in at the community larder. He was called Peter Leet. He came in and he was a frail man with a stick, and he had a sign on his arm. And I said, so you do this for your family? And he said, no, I do it for people who can't get here.
It was 15 people he did it for, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. He said, I do it for them. He said, and I said, really? He said, yeah. I said, that's amazing. He said, I do sort of 5 a week. I do different groups, you know, older people who can't get down from the high rises. I said, that's extraordinary. And I said, so what's this sign? He said, I'm blind. And I just almost fell off my chair. I just thought.
But you got quite tearful, actually.
I did, because I just thought the heroism of this guy. You know, this guy's a real hero. And I just thought, wow, you know, this man has really given something of his life to this horrible situation and trying to make it better for other people.
So many people in this country, in the whole of the UK, are now literally on the poverty line.
Yeah.
And it's probably going to get worse before it gets any better. 11% inflation, this energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, all these things conspiring, the fallout from the pandemic. You saw at the sharp end. I mean, you went back to your hometown and you were horrified by what you found. What do we do about this?
It's a big question. It's a big issue. I think independence would help.
Do you?
I do.
In Scotland's case?
Certainly in Scotland's case, but I also think elsewhere it would help.
I mean, it would only help if the economy was revived.
That's right.
And many economists think that Scottish independence would be bad for the Scottish economy.
No, well, I would argue with that, but I haven't got the time to do that here. But no, I mean, I feel that we're going from bad to worse. But we've again and again and again, we have neglected our own. And it's suddenly at a bad time now when everything is against us, the cost of living crisis, what have you, the war, the pandemic, what the pandemic has done. But even so, their lives haven't changed. The budget didn't help them, those people, and it never does. It never does. It never looks to the poorest. We don't concern ourselves with that. They're an embarrassment. Let's put them over there. But now, and why I wanted to do this program was to bring it to the fore and say, these people matter, and we have to do something about it. We have to have some attitude that we haven't got, that we've kind of elbowed so long, for too long, actually. And that's what I feel.
It's powerful stuff, and I commend people to watch it. How the Other Half Live on Channel 5. Can't let you go without asking you about Succession, one of my favourite shows ever in the history of television. You've got a new series coming in the new year. Can you tell me anything, or do you have to shoot me?
Piers, I don't have a gun. But if I did, you'd have to be shot.
Is Logan Roy in Series 6?
Well, there isn't Series 6. We're only Series 4.
I know. It's a trick question.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, let's see what happens. I mean,
In other words, does he survive this series?
Well,
it's 4 you're doing now, so it's
yeah, he'll survive this series.
Yeah.
No, there'll be no problem about
There's no
that.
death we have to...
No, none of that. No, that's all speculation and nonsense. No, I mean, there's a lot to be dealt with in terms of who's going to take over, and there's a lot to be dealt with in terms of the writers and where they can go with it. See, the great thing about Jesse Armstrong is he doesn't stay too long at the fair.
Right.
Because each season has topped the last season. So we have to keep talking.
But it reminds me of Aaron Sorkin on The West Wing, where the first 4 seasons were fantastic. Then he left and the writing collapsed and the whole thing...
And that's what we don't want to happen.
Yeah. Would you rather end on a high?
I would rather end on a high.
Yeah.
You know, and
leave them wanting more, not less.
Yes, and well, you know, there's I'm no names, no pacto, but there's a show called Billions, you know, and Damien Lewis left, and they're still going on with it.
Yeah, I know.
But it's
over-egging the souffle. That's what I would call.
A wee bit.
How many times a day do you get told to tell people to F off?
All the time.
Like a dozen times a day?
I was at the Scottish BAFTAs last night, and I couldn't get away from people. You know? And of course, it's, as I said before, it's the best thing to tell people.
Yes.
Because when you're fed up with them, you go, oh, you know.
You can say it. We'll bleep you.
Oh, don't bother me anymore. Just the off.
And finally, as a Scot, who do you most want to win the World Cup? England or Wales? Or somebody else?
I have to reserve judgment on that.
Oh, come on, Tom. Get off the fence.
No, I'm not. I can't do that.
Do you want England to beat, say, the United States?
I think I'd like to see England do well because I think he's done a great job.
Southgate.
Yeah, I think he's really done a great job. And there's some great players. We've got a few good Arsenal players in there.
Yeah,
well,
Saka on fire.
Saka, what a player.
Tremendous.
I was worried about him because he got... a couple of games ago, they took his legs from him, and I thought, oh, God.
He's made a tough stuff at Arsenal. Yeah. Brian, brilliant to see you.